So I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on the land of the Kaurna people, whose people's sovereignty has never been ceded, and to think about and recognise the different forms of learning and knowledge sharing that have been ongoing on this land for time immemorial. My name is Amelie Vanderstock. I wear a couple of hats. I'm at the University of Sydney doing a PhD in insect pollinator ecology, citizen science and urban agriculture. But today I'm wearing my Leard Forest Research Node hat. And as part of some honours research I did in 2016 with this incredible group, I'm going to be talking about particulate matter pollution and some citizen science we did in northwest New South Wales. So air pollution is not just an issue for cities, it's also an important rural issue. With coal mines, with agriculture in these places, there's all forms of air pollutants that come about. One particular air pollutant of interest is particulate matter. So that is these fine specks of dust, both solid and liquid particles in the air, and they're so fine that you can see on a human hair here, it's just that 10 microns in diameter, or those 2.5 microns. And these come from a variety of sources in rural areas, including blasting, excavation and transport from mines, but also from sowing and ploughing in agriculture. So it's a complex issue to look at where those sources are coming from. Coal dust or particulate matter is important because it's harmful to human health. It causes all sorts of respiratory diseases and non-fatal heart attacks, as well as asthma. And it's also harmful to plant health. So by increasing the transpiration rate and leaf temperature, it can then decrease photosynthesis and growth rate. And this is obviously important in an agricultural area because that damage to plants can also affect yields and livelihoods. So I'm often asked, coal dust, particulate matter, what's the difference? Well, coal dust is a particular kind of particulate matter that contains these carbonates, silicates, and trace heavy metals. But it is not just the coal part of the coal dust that's important, it's all sorts of particulate matter that is important. So going over to our field site over in Maules Creek and Boggabri, you drive northwest, 8 hours from Sydney, and you get to this small town. You're surrounded by agriculture, you're surrounded by forest, and also these coal mines in an area. And I don't know why it's doing this automatically. But so we can see that there are different land values and different perceptions of the land, and this causes an issue for measuring air pollution and for what community wants from an air pollution monitoring scheme. Coal mining in this region, there are 3 main coal mines. There's the Maules Creek coal mine, which began construction in 2014, so it's a very new coal mine, a very big coal mine. And there's also the Boggabri and the Tarrawonga mine, which are a bit smaller. Oh dear, that was exciting. So introducing the Leard Forest Research Node. So we are a network of community, of farmers, of university students, of subject matter specialists, and we've come together to do citizen science in an area where air pollution monitoring has some complications and where community really want to be involved in the process. We started with doing some fauna and flora surveys. We've also done some noise pollution monitoring, and I invite you to have some more chats to us about that later. And with this, we've involved the Australian Student Environment Network, or ASEN for short, to increase those city and rural partnerships and bringing students out into the field to really see what it is like on the land. Our main goals are about building community capacity, linking this urban-rural, and creating good data, valid science, and doing this with community. And what's really crucial to our model is to then use this to influence decision makers and the management of pollution issues in our area, to use it as a lobbying tool rather than a science outcome in and of itself. So dust pollution in Maules Creek, the way it's measured at the moment, is that the mining companies such as Whitehaven have their own air pollution monitoring network schemes. They do self-monitoring and self-reporting of that data. They then upload that data or give it to OEH and the EPA, who then cross-reference that, and then it becomes publicly available. But where it starts is with the coal mining doing their own monitoring. And that's what really causes this community concern, because the data that they're receiving does not match their personal experience. from this hazy, dusty morning that farmers are experiencing every day. And when we looked at that, that experience is valid in and of itself. But then corroborated by this data, which we found between 18 to 28% of the particulate matter that was reported by the mining companies, I'm really sorry, it keeps automatically changing, has negative values. So if we're thinking about those specks of dust in the air, it's impossible to have negative specks of dust. So that's what this data is suggesting, that between 18 to 28 in 2015 and 2016% is negative specks of dust. That's impossible. And what happens, and I won't go into this graph in too much detail, but I just want to point out that when there is a trough in the grey, the rolling average of dust, you see a peak in the red, which is the negative amounts of dust. So when we're seeing these negative values of dust, we're seeing that the air pollution seems better, it seems safer, and that's just not the case. So this was reported in the Sydney Morning Herald, so it received some attention from the cities, and it really establishes why we need to do independent dust monitoring and where the role of the Leard Forest Research Node comes in. So we began with 2 projects. We've done a number of projects, but I only have time to talk about 2 of them. And that is dust deposition gauges and foliar dust deposition, and I'll go through them individually. So with the dust deposition gauges, what happens is the mining network, and this happens nationally, you have essentially a glass bottle with a glass funnel which collects dust, and this is rotated on a monthly basis. And that can get the dust that is deposited into these bottles and give an idea of deposited particulate matter. So what we did was we set up a series of our own dust gauges, and our good friend Terry here, he designed and created these based on the Australian standards. And then when we changed those bottles over, we sent them to an independent laboratory for analysis, and we fundraised with the community to be able to do this. And we set it up. Setting them up was a real community affair. It brought lots of generations together. It brought lots of people together. It's really exciting. Despite being a cold, rainy, windy day, everyone was very excited to set them up. And changing them over monthly. This was also a collaboration between farmers in the community, between city folk. Sometimes, getting bogged in Boggabri and trying to get the dust gauges in and out. That was a real exciting kind of partnership, empowering way of engaging with science in different ways. And this is what it looks like out in the field. You can see a grazing field, and then behind there is the mine overburden, which is that artificial hill of matter. And we did this along a transect. So down here we have the mine in that corner there, and then the prevailing wind in the area is southeasterly, so we created a northwest transect. We had 3 gauges along that transect, and what's interesting about the gauges, G1, gauge 1, is that it was within a few hundred metres of the Whitehaven gauge. And so we could look a little bit about that pattern of distance from the mine, and we could also look at are there any relative or absolute changes with the Whitehaven data. And that Whitehaven gauge is just one of a series of monitoring stations in the area. So what we found was, I'll just point out this graph. So on the y-axis, we have the deposited particulate matter over monthly. On the x-axis, we have the Whitehaven gauge, 1 closest to the mine to 3 furthest from the mine. And then in colours, we have the months. So the first thing that jumps out at me is that September, October, whoa, we have this crazy spike in dust. What is going on? And that actually makes a lot of sense because it's harvest season. So these gauges are out in fields. We're looking at deposited particulate matter, which lands quite close to the source. And so you'd expect to see a spike in those months. What is interesting is that in the Whitehaven dust gauge, we don't see that spike. And that's possibly because it's reported on a rolling average as opposed to a seasonal pattern. So that's an interesting point of comparison. The other thing I forgot to point out was on the 4, that number, that dotted line, that represents 4 grams per metre squared per month. And if you cross that line, whoa, we've got some air pollution issues in the area. We really need to look into that. The other thing I want to point out is that we don't really have a pattern of distance. It might look like it because the first October is so high, but really dust pollution is really complex, and we really need to be looking at this in more depth and in different ways. So we did look at it in more depth and in a different way. We looked at foliar particulate deposition, foliar being on foliage on leaves. So what we did is, again, we set up this transect, and this time we had 5 replicates at each distance at 2, 5, 7, and 12 kilometres. And at each station, we had a little tomato station. And tomatoes are great because they've got these hairy leaves that capture dust and stuff. And so we put these out, we put them out for 6 days, and then we chopped off their heads, and we brought them to the lab, and we measured the amount of dust on them, and to see, is there any pattern of distance on leaf matter? And indeed there was. So we can see from this graph that close to the mine is significantly a greater amount of dust than the farthest from the mine. And the middle point, that 7-kilometre point, acts as an intermediary between. The other thing to look on this graph is that 0.13 micrograms of dust per centimetre squared of leaf. Now that is a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of dust. That's a speck of dust. But we're talking about the amount of dust on these small pockets of plants. When you multiply that over time, and you multiply that over fields, that could be quite a lot of dust, and that could maybe have some agricultural ramifications. So that's quite interesting in and of itself. And comparing the dust gauge data with the foliage data, it's interesting to note that maybe we need to be thinking about different ways of doing air pollution monitoring and linking with different systems that the government is also doing in the area. So some outcomes, the theme of this talk. We shared our data with the Boggabri Community Forum, and we invited the Environmental Protection Authority, the EPA, to come along and share what they had to say about air quality in the area and about a developing Namoi Regional Air Quality Monitoring Network. So that was really exciting to have along. Also, representatives from the mines came along. So it was really like we filled up this hall and we were able to have those conversations and talk about particulate matter pollution in the area using a platform of that data. We also shared our results with the Narrabri Shire Council, and having that policy linked to our research is really important. So talking to those local decision makers. We've also had a program which really highlights mutual education between city students, between city residents, by providing those road trips, those citizen science trips, and with our folk out in the country. And there's so much different learning and sharing that can happen across both of these groups. And it's really powerful to be in a space where that can happen. Upskilling communities to do ecological monitoring. This is an amazing fact that, say, groups like Streamwatch have been doing for generations. And it was really great to be able to do that in this really small rural town around air quality monitoring. We'd really love to help facilitate that more. As well as fostering positive farmer and scientist relationships. So I think Margot Law was talking about it earlier at this conference, is that sometimes those relationships can be quite tense, but by upskilling each other, by doing this mutual cultural and scientific education with each other, it can be a really great way to foster those relationships, make them stronger, and then be able to do this monitoring together. Finally, some challenges and next directions. We're really hoping to contribute to conversations around the Namoi Regional Air Quality Monitoring Network, because this is going to be rolled out in New South Wales very soon, and we really want Boggabri to be on the map with that. So to have those conversations with community and with the government bodies that are regulating that is really important to us. We also want to continue to lobby for a particulate attribution study, because I mentioned rural particulates are really complicated, lots of sources. And at the moment, we're doing a water quality research and groundwater baseline data project. So I'd just like to acknowledge the fabulous community and the fabulous people that have come together to make these projects possible and who I just love working with. And invite any questions, but I believe we might do that at the end. So I might just end on a quote from a beautiful member. For us, it doesn't end when we uncover the numbers. Our approach takes responsibility to solve or at least address the problem. And that's what the Leard Forest Research Node is about. Thank you.